Marcus Webb had spent 7 years building his life in the Meadowbrook subdivision, a quiet cul-de-sac on the outskirts of Portland, where young families and retirees coexisted in careful silence. He'd bought the house with his ex-wife, Jennifer, during better times. The divorce had been painful but amicable. She'd kept the house in the city. He'd kept this 200 square feet of faded brick and endless possibility. For 5 years, he'd lived peacefully. He mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings. He nodded to neighbors. He never complained. He was the kind of neighbor people didn't think about because he gave them nothing to think about. Then 2 years ago, Jennifer had gotten engaged to Derek, a cryptocurrency bro with a Range Rover and the kind of confidence that came from never having genuinely failed at anything. Derek had money. Derek had ideas. And Derek, unfortunately, had decided that Marcus's backyard would be the perfect place for a swimming pool. "It's in the original development agreement," Derek had explained one Saturday morning in June, standing in Marcus's driveway with a rolled-up document in his hand. Jennifer stood beside him, her expression apologetic but resolute. Section 4.2. Any structural improvements to community-adjacent properties require community oversight, but the pool is technically on your property, so technically it's allowed. Marcus had read the document. He'd called a lawyer. The lawyer had confirmed what Derek's lawyer had already prepared. The pool existed in a legal gray area. Technically, Marcus owned the land. Technically, the pool was his. But the subdivision had communal covenant restrictions that made things complicated. "They can't force you to take it down," his lawyer, Patricia Chen, had said over coffee. "But they can make your life difficult if you do." That had been 2 years ago. The pool had arrived in August, installed by a contractor who worked quickly and efficiently. It was a saltwater infinity pool, 15,000 gallons of pristine blue water that caught the afternoon sun and reflected it across the neighboring yards. It was beautiful. It was also a daily reminder that Derek had invaded Marcus's space, used his property, and gotten away with it because the law was murky and Marcus was tired. For a year, Marcus had tolerated it. He'd tolerated the parties Derek threw, not at his own house, but clearly celebrating Derek's investment. He'd tolerated the sounds of splashing and laughter drifting through the fence. He'd tolerated the way the pool's circulation pump ran at dawn, disturbing his sleep. But what he couldn't tolerate was Karen Halloway. Karen lived 3 houses down, in a tastefully decorated colonial with black shutters and a manicured landscape. She was 42, divorced, and possessed the particular brand of energy that came from someone who'd found purpose in community involvement. She was the president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. She'd also appointed herself the guardian of the subdivision's collective conscience. The first time she'd approached Marcus about the pool, she'd brought a petition. It had 43 signatures, nearly everyone on the street except for the handful of people Derek had actually invited to his pool parties. "It changes the character of the neighborhood," Karen had explained, her voice pitched in that particular register of false concern. She wore white linen and carried herself like a woman who'd never been told no. "We all have rules, we all follow them, and this," she gestured toward the fence, toward the pool hidden beyond it, "sends a message that some people are above the rules." Marcus had listened politely, he'd taken the petition, and he'd done nothing. The second time Karen had approached him, 6 months later, was different. She'd had a lawyer's letter. The HOA, she'd explained, was considering legal action. The pool violated covenant restrictions. It disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood. It set a precedent that would lead to chaos. "All you have to do is take it down," Karen had said, standing on his porch in her athletic wear, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail. "And this all goes away." "It's not my pool," Marcus had replied flatly. "It's Derek's, he put it in, he can take it down." "But it's on your property," Karen had said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "That makes it your responsibility." Marcus had closed the door. For another 6 months, nothing happened. The letters stopped. Karen's greetings grew colder. At the mailbox, at the grocery store, on the rare occasions he ran into other neighbors, there was a distance now. Marcus had become the problem, not Derek. Derek was charming and generous and had the decency to live 3 miles away. Marcus was the one who'd enabled it. Marcus was the one who'd chosen money over community. It had been Jennifer who'd finally cracked. She'd called him in late May, her voice strained. "Derek's getting sued," she'd said without preamble. "The HOA, they're suing both of us, for the pool, for damages, for violation of covenant. It's Marcus, it's a lot of money." Marcus had listened to the familiar tone in her voice, the one that meant she wanted something from him. They'd been divorced for 6 years, but they'd been together for 10 before that, and he still understood the complex calculus of her desires. "What do you want me to do?" he'd asked. "Take down the pool," Jennifer had said. "I know it's not your responsibility. I know Derek put it there, but he won't take it down. He says it's a violation of his rights. He's hired a lawyer. We're fighting the HOA, but Marcus, if you just take it down, if it's off your property, the whole thing goes away. That's what our lawyer says." "So you want me to pay for removing a pool I never wanted?" "I want you to do the right thing," Jennifer had said, and he'd heard the tears in her voice. She'd always been good at making her problems feel like his fault. He'd hung up without answering. That had been 3 weeks ago. The lawsuit had apparently escalated. Karen had apparently gotten more aggressive, and on a Tuesday morning in early June, Marcus had made a decision that would reshape everything. He'd called a demolition company. The quote came back at $8,500 for complete pool removal. Marcus had written the check. The appointment was scheduled for Saturday morning at 7 a.m. before most of the neighborhood was awake. He'd expected Derek to find out and show up. He'd expected Jennifer to call, crying. He'd even expected some kind of legal cease and desist. He had not expected Karen to call the police. Saturday morning arrived cool and gray, the kind of June weather that felt like Portland was holding its breath. Marcus had slept poorly, not from anxiety but from a strange clarity. He'd made a decision, and decisions, once made, had a way of simplifying things. The world contracted. Everything became binary before and after. The demolition crew arrived at 6:47 a.m. in a white truck with Apex Demolition stenciled on the side. There were 3 of them, a foreman named Rick with a shaved head and forearms like tree trunks, and 2 younger guys with energy drinks and the casual competence of people who did this kind of work regularly. Marcus showed them the pool. They walked the perimeter discussing load-bearing and water displacement. Rick pulled out a tablet and showed Marcus diagrams of how the process would work. They'd drain the pool first. That would take a few hours. Then they'd cut it into sections and haul the pieces out. The whole job would probably take until late afternoon. "You sure about this?" Rick asked, not unkindly. "People usually feel weird about it," last guy cried. "I'm sure," Marcus said. By 7:30 a.m., they'd started the drainage pumps. Water began flowing out through thick hoses, racing across Marcus's backyard in a small river toward the street. The sound was tremendous, a roar of disruption that seemed to announce to the entire neighborhood that something irreversible was happening. Marcus stood in his kitchen, drinking coffee, and watched from the window. His hands were steady. His heart rate was normal. He felt lighter than he had in 2 years. At 8:15 a.m., his phone rang. It was Jennifer. "What are you doing?" she asked, and her voice had that particular pitch of hysteria that meant Derek was in the room with her, feeding her lines. "Taking down the pool," Marcus said simply. "You can't, there's an injunction. Derek's lawyer filed a temporary injunction yesterday. You're not allowed to touch that pool." Marcus checked his email. Sure enough, there was a message from Patricia Chen, his lawyer, timestamped 5:47 p.m. the day before. "Marcus, Derek's legal team filed a TRO, temporary restraining order, against you regarding the pool removal. I'm filing our response today, but legally speaking, you should wait until the judge." He'd read enough, he'd deleted it. "I didn't get it in time," he said to Jennifer. "You got it, Marcus, you got it. It was in your email. You have to stop. You have to stop right now or Derek's going to sue you. He's going to sue you personally." "Good luck with that," Marcus said and hung up. The pool was half-drained by 9 a.m. Water no longer flowed out. The system had reached equilibrium, the rest of the pool slowly leaking out through the drainage holes they'd cut into the walls. Marcus went outside and watched as Rick and one of the younger crew members, a kid named Tyler with a nose ring and impressive biceps, began cutting the pool's edge with a circular saw. The sound was like a dentist's drill amplified 1,000 times. A light came on in Karen's house. Then in the Hendersons' house next door, curtains moved. By 9:30 a.m., neighbors had begun to appear in their yards, ostensibly tending to gardens or retrieving things from garages, but really just watching. Marcus recognized the curiosity in their faces, the primal need to bear witness to destruction. His phone rang again. It was Patricia, his lawyer. Tell me you haven't started yet, she said. Too late, Marcus replied. Jesus, Marcus, do you understand what you've done? That TRO is legally binding. By proceeding with this demolition, you're in contempt of court. Derek can sue you for the cost of the pool, the cost of the injunction, and potentially damages. This is extremely stupid. Can he win? Marcus asked. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Probably not. The TRO is probably not going to hold up. The pool is on your property. You have the right to modify your own property. But the legal fees alone, Marcus, you're looking at $50,000, $60,000 in legal fees before this is resolved. Marcus watched Rick hoist a piece of fiberglass out of the water. It gleamed in the morning light. I've made my decision, he said and hung up. By 10 a.m., the police hadn't arrived yet, but the neighborhood had fully mobilized. At least 15 people were now visible in their yards or on the street. Some looked sympathetic. Marcus recognized the Chens, who'd always seemed nice. Others looked scandalized. One woman whom he didn't recognize was taking photographs with her phone. The pool was coming apart now. Rick and Tyler had switched from cutting to actual demolition. They used sledgehammers. The sound was extraordinary, each strike sending a shock wave of destruction through the fiberglass and concrete. Each hit was a small explosion of satisfying violence. Marcus found himself smiling. He'd read somewhere that humans have a deep psychological need for justice, for symmetry, for the restoration of balance. Watching the pool that had invaded his life be systematically destroyed felt like justice. It felt like balance. It felt like the world righting itself. By 11 a.m., Derek showed up. He came in his Range Rover, tires squealing as he took the corner too fast. He was still in his pajamas, expensive silk ones, and his face was the color of an overripe tomato. Stop, he screamed, getting out of the car. Stop right now, I have a court order. Rick paused mid-swing. He looked at Marcus. Marcus nodded. Rick continued swinging. Derek ran toward the fence, waving a piece of paper that was almost certainly the same TRO that Patricia had warned him about. That's my property, Derek screamed. That's my property, this is theft, this is destruction of property. Marcus walked over to the fence. Derek was on the other side, red-faced and sputtering, his silk pajamas now soaked with sweat. It's on my property, Marcus said calmly, and I want it gone. You're going to pay for this, Derek hissed. Do you understand what you've done? My lawyers are going to destroy you. Your life is over. Probably, Marcus agreed, but at least I won't have to look at that pool anymore. Derek's face looked like it might actually explode. He turned and ran back toward his car, still holding the court order, screaming about lawyers and lawsuits and the financial ruin he would visit upon Marcus. He drove away with the same reckless speed he'd arrived with. By noon, the pool was 3/4 demolished. What had been a pristine symbol of Derek's wealth and invasiveness was now a scattered landscape of broken fiberglass, twisted metal, and chunks of concrete. It looked like a war zone. It looked like justice. Rick was wiping his forehead with a bandana, clearly satisfied with the work. Tyler was loading pieces into the truck. The third crew member was sweeping up smaller chunks. We'll haul this to the recycling facility, Rick said. You're looking at maybe another hour to finish the demolition, and then we'll clean up the site. There'll be a concrete pad left. You'll want a landscape over that or pour something new, but the pool will be gone. That's perfect, Marcus said. His phone rang. It was Karen. Marcus, I'm calling to inform you that I'm reporting this violation to the police, she said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. What you're doing is illegal. You're in violation of a court order. You're destroying community property. It's my property, Marcus interrupted. And you're creating a public nuisance, Karen continued, ignoring him. I have photographs and I have witnesses, and I'm filing a report with the city inspector. The police are on their way. She hung up. Marcus looked at his watch. It was 12:37. The police, he assumed, would arrive within the hour. He went inside and made a sandwich. He ate it slowly, watching from the kitchen window as Rick and his crew continued the demolition. He thought about Derek, probably on the phone with his lawyer right now. He thought about Jennifer, probably crying. He thought about Karen, probably getting dressed in her most sympathetic yoga wear. And he thought about the fact that for the first time in 2 years, he'd done something that felt completely, unambiguously true. The police car was a Meadowbrook City patrol vehicle, and Officer Reynolds was a woman in her early 50s with the weary expression of someone who dealt with neighborhood disputes for a living. She pulled up to Marcus's house with her lights off, not a dramatic arrival, but a tired one. She exited the vehicle slowly, looking at the demolished pool, the pile of debris, the construction equipment. She looked at Marcus, who was standing in his driveway, and he could see her already calculating whether this was actually a crime or just another property dispute masquerading as one. "Marcus Webb?" she asked. "That's me," he said. "I received a complaint about illegal demolition and violation of a court order," Officer Reynolds said, pulling out a notebook. "I'm going to need to understand what's happening here." Before Marcus could answer, Corinne arrived. She pulled up in a white Lexus SUV, her face arranged in an expression of righteous concern. She wore white athletic wear and white sneakers, and her blonde hair was perfect. She looked like she'd stepped out of a Lululemon advertisement if those advertisements were directed by a paranoid mind. "Officer Reynolds," Corinne said, approaching with her hand outstretched. "Thank you so much for coming so quickly. I'm Corinne Halloway, president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association." Officer Reynolds shook her hand with a kind of detached politeness that suggested she'd done this dance before. "I'm just trying to understand what's happening here," Officer Reynolds said. "What's happening is that this man," Karen pointed at Marcus, "is destroying community property in direct violation of a court order. He's in contempt of court. He's creating a public nuisance, and he's doing it deliberately with full knowledge that it's illegal." "It's not community property," Marcus said calmly. "It's my property." "There's a swimming pool on your property," Officer Reynolds said, her tone suggesting she already understood this was going to be complicated. "There was," Marcus corrected. Officer Reynolds looked at the demolished pool, then back at Marcus. She pulled out her phone and dialed. "Hey, it's Reynolds," she said into the phone. "I've got a property dispute here in Meadowbrook. There's a court order involved. I'm going to need you to check on the status." She gave Marcus's address and waited while the person on the other end presumably looked it up. Officer Reynolds's expression changed minutely. "I see," she said, "and that was filed when?" Another pause. "Okay, thank you." She hung up and turned to both of them. "So here's what I'm seeing," Officer Reynolds said. "There's a temporary restraining order filed yesterday by Derek Morrison against Marcus Webb regarding a swimming pool. That TRO would technically apply to any demolition activities." "Exactly," Corinne said, and Marcus could hear the triumph in her voice. "However," Officer Reynolds continued, "a TRO is a temporary measure that lasts until a hearing can be held. The burden is on the person seeking the TRO to prove immediate and irreparable harm. In a property dispute, that's a high bar." She paused. "I've also been told that the underlying case, the HOA's suit against Derek Morrison and Jennifer Morrison, is likely to result in judgment in favor of the pool owner being required to remove it. So technically, Marcus here might have a legal right to do this." "But he didn't wait for that judgment," Corinne said. "He decided to take the law into his own hands." "Ms. Halloway, I understand your concern," Officer Reynolds said, and her voice had taken on that particular tone that police officers use when they're about to deliver news that someone doesn't want to hear. "But property rights are complex. And from what I'm seeing, Mr. Webb is on his property, doing something to his property that he likely has the right to do, even if there's some legal question about the timing." "You're not going to arrest him?" Corinne asked, and her voice had risen an octave. "For what?" Officer Reynolds asked. "For modifying his own property? Ma'am, I can't arrest someone for that." "He's in contempt of court," Corinne said, and now she was pointing at Officer Reynolds with accusatory precision. "He's violating a court order. That's a crime." "It might be, technically," Officer Reynolds agreed. "But that's something a judge decides, not me. I can't enforce civil court orders. That's for the court system. What I can do is make a report, which I will, and suggest that both parties involve their lawyers." She looked at Marcus. "You probably should have waited for the judge's ruling," she said, not unkindly. "But I can't stop you from demolishing your own pool." Corinne looked like she might actually have a stroke. Her face was red. Her hands were shaking. For a moment, Marcus almost felt bad for her. She had clearly expected a very different outcome to this encounter. "This is ridiculous," Corinne said. "This is an affront to this community. This man is destroying community property." "It's not community property," Officer Reynolds said, her tone taking on a sharper edge. It's private property in a private dispute. I've checked the law. The HOA can pursue civil remedies, but as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing criminal happening here. She walked back to her car. I'll file a report. Your lawyers will handle the rest, she said to both of them, and I'd suggest keeping things civil while the system works through this. She drove away, leaving Marcus and Karen standing in the driveway. Rick and Tyler had paused their work, uncertain whether they should continue. Karen stared at Marcus, and in her eyes he saw something he hadn't expected. Not anger, but a kind of wounded betrayal, as if he'd personally violated some sacred agreement between them. You've made a terrible mistake, she said quietly. You have no idea what you've started. She turned and walked back to her car. She drove away with more restraint than Derek had, but with a kind of grim purpose that felt somehow more ominous. Marcus looked at Rick. Keep going, he said. By 3 p.m., the pool was completely gone. What remained was a concrete pad scarred with drain holes and surrounded by the indentations where the equipment had sat for 2 years. It looked like an absence, which, Marcus supposed, was exactly what it was. Rick handed him a bill for $8,500 marked paid. Marcus signed the paperwork. The demolition crew loaded the last pieces of fiberglass and metal into their truck. By 4:30 p.m., they were gone, leaving Marcus alone with his backyard, which suddenly seemed impossibly large. He stood in the center of where the pool had been and tried to feel what he'd expected to feel. Triumph, vindication, the satisfaction of having reclaimed his space. Instead, he felt a peculiar kind of dread. Officer Reynolds had seemed experienced in these kinds of disputes. She'd processed it with the bureaucratic weariness of someone who'd handled dozens of situations like this. But Karen's final words kept echoing in his head. You have no idea what you've started. That night, Marcus received his first legal document. It was a motion for contempt of court, filed by Derek Morrison's lawyer, seeking immediate sanctions against Marcus for violating the temporary restraining order. The motion alleged that Marcus had acted with willful disregard for the court's authority. It requested that Marcus be held in contempt, which could result in fines up to $25,000 and potential jail time. It also alleged that Marcus had caused Derek emotional distress, damaged his property, and violated his legal rights. Marcus read it 3 times, waiting for panic to set in. It didn't. Instead, he felt oddly calm, as if by taking action, by doing something irreversible, he'd somehow moved beyond the reach of Karen's machinations. Whatever came next was out of his hands. Whatever came next was in the hands of the legal system, and the legal system, at least, was supposed to care about things like facts and rights. Marcus learned this by reading the article in the Meadowbrook Gazette, a weekly newspaper that mostly covered zoning board decisions and school announcements. But this week, the front page featured a photograph of Karen standing in her pristine yard, her hand over her heart with the headline, Local woman fights for community values as neighbor destroys shared property. Marcus read it in his kitchen, coffee growing cold in his hands. The article, written by someone named Patricia Summers, painted a picture that bore only passing resemblance to what had actually happened. It described Karen as a dedicated community volunteer who has tirelessly worked to preserve the character of Meadowbrook. It described the pool as an eyesore that had already been ruled illegal by the HOA and was in the process of being removed through proper legal channels. I just want what's best for this community, Karen was quoted as saying. Mr. Webb's actions were reckless and illegal. He had a court order to preserve the pool while the legal process worked through the system. By destroying it, he violated the court's authority and showed a disregard for the rule of law that I find deeply troubling. Marcus read the quote 3 times. None of that was true. The pool had not been ruled illegal. The legal process had not been working through the system in any organized way, and the court order had been the opposite of what she claimed. It had been filed by Derek to stop Marcus from doing exactly what Marcus had done. But it didn't matter what was true. It mattered what people believed. That became abundantly clear on Tuesday, when he ran into his neighbors at the grocery store. He was in the produce section, examining tomatoes, when Linda Chen, whose family he'd always gotten along with, walked past him without making eye contact. He greeted her. She gave him a small, uncomfortable wave and changed aisles. In the checkout line, An older man he didn't recognize looked at him and shook his head disapprovingly. By Wednesday, there was a second article in the Meadowbrook Gazette, this one featuring quotes from concerned neighbors. A woman named Patricia Morrison, Derek's mother, apparently described how devastated Derek was by the destruction of the pool. Another neighbor, someone named John Halloway, Corinne's ex-husband, Marcus would later learn, expressed concern about the precedent being set by someone who felt entitled to destroy property on a whim. Not a single quote from Marcus. Not a single perspective that acknowledged that this was his property and he had the right to demolish it. By Thursday, there was a meeting of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. Marcus wasn't invited, but he received an email informing him that the HOA was considering filing additional complaints with the city regarding his property's lack of landscape restoration after unauthorized demolition activities. Patricia Chen, his lawyer, was increasingly alarmed. "They're building a narrative," she said over the phone. "They're turning this into a story about a property owner who acts recklessly and violates court authority, instead of a story about someone who demolished a pool on his own property. The narrative matters because it influences how a judge might view this." "How can they do that?" Marcus asked. "None of it is true." "It doesn't have to be true to be effective," Patricia said grimly. "It just has to be believable, and they're making it very believable." The hearing on Derek's motion for contempt was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Patricia prepared Marcus thoroughly. They went through his options, his possible defenses, his best strategy. The core of their argument would be simple. Marcus had the right to modify his own property. The court order was issued to Derek, not to Marcus, and the pool had been a violation of the property covenants in the first place. It should have been straightforward. The hearing took place in Multnomah County Circuit Court in a room that smelled like old wood and older paper. Judge Patricia Mendez presided, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she'd seen every variation of human pettiness that the law allowed. Derek's lawyer, a man named Richard Hutchins with an expensive suit and the kind of confidence that came from knowing you were in the room with the most powerful person present, opened with a statement about the rule of law and the sanctity of court authority. "Your Honor," Hutchins said, "the respondent chose to ignore a direct court order. Whether or not the underlying property dispute favors him is irrelevant to the question of whether he violated this court's authority. By proceeding with the demolition despite the TRO, Mr. Webb demonstrated a willful contempt for the judicial system itself." Patricia Chen stood and made her counterargument. She was good, articulate, precise, focused on the facts. She pointed out that the TRO, while technically applying to demolition activities, had been issued in a case where Marcus was not even a named party. She argued that Marcus, as the owner of the property, had the fundamental right to modify or demolish structures on his land. She suggested that the real dispute was civil in nature, and that contempt charges were a misuse of criminal authority. Judge Mendez listened. She asked questions. She seemed skeptical of both sides. And then Derek took the stand. Under questioning from Hutchins, Derek described how he'd invested in the pool, how he'd done everything by the book, how he had a legitimate right to improve the property. He described Marcus's demolition as an act of pure malice, done specifically to harm me. Hutchins asked him about his emotional state. Derek, with the practiced sadness of someone who'd rehearsed this, described feeling violated and betrayed. He talked about the thousands of dollars he'd lost, the investment he'd made, the way Marcus's actions had destroyed his peace of mind. It was all carefully calculated to make Marcus seem like the villain. When Patricia cross-examined Derek, she asked the obvious questions. "Did you own the property where the pool was located?" "No," Derek admitted, "but..." "Did you have permission from Marcus Webb to install the pool?" "It was his ex-wife's idea." "Did you have permission from Marcus Webb?" Patricia pressed. "Not explicitly, but..." "And you installed an expensive pool on someone else's property without their permission?" Derek's face reddened. "The property covenants allow it." "But Marcus Webb explicitly objected to the pool's presence on his property. Is that correct?" "He made his feelings known, yes." Patricia sat down. Judge Mendez looked at the papers in front of her, then at Marcus, then at Derek. "Here's what I'm thinking," she said, and her voice had that particular quality of judicial authority that suggested a decision had been made. The respondent was not a named party in the original restraining order. The TRO was filed against Derek Morrison by Derek Morrison's own ex-wife and her new partner, correct? Correct, Your Honor, Patricia said. And Marcus Webb was not served with notice of this TRO. Patricia hesitated. Marcus had seen the email from his lawyer warning him about the TRO, but he hadn't actually been formally served with the order itself. The email had come after he'd already begun the demolition process. He received constructive notice, Hutchins argued. Constructive notice is not the same as actual service, Judge Mendez said. And I'm troubled by the fact that the TRO was filed the same day the demolition was scheduled to occur. It feels less like a sincere attempt to preserve the status quo and more like a tactical filing designed to prevent Mr. Webb from exercising his property rights. She paused, and in that pause, Marcus felt a small stirring of hope. That said, Judge Mendez continued, I'm also troubled by the fact that Mr. Webb chose to proceed with demolition on a Saturday morning without waiting to see if the legal process would resolve this matter. Property rights exist within a framework of law, and ignoring that framework, even when one might be right on the merits, is problematic. She set down the papers. Here's my ruling. The motion for contempt is denied. Mr. Webb was not properly served with the temporary restraining order, and even if he had been, the circumstances suggest the TRO was improperly filed. However, I'm scheduling a hearing on the underlying property dispute to determine, once and for all, whether the pool installation was a violation of the property covenants. At that hearing, all parties will have the opportunity to present evidence. And Mr. Webb will have the opportunity to explain his actions in the context of that broader dispute. She looked directly at Marcus. My advice to all parties would be to work with their lawyers to resolve this matter expeditiously. The legal system is not a tool for neighborhood feuds. Use it wisely, or I will find ways to make this process considerably more unpleasant for everyone involved. She gavelled the hearing closed. Outside the courtroom, Patricia smiled and squeezed Marcus's arm. That was good, she said. That was very good. Mendez clearly sees through what Hutchins was doing. But Derek's face, as he left the courtroom, suggested he had no intention of giving up. He was talking rapidly on his phone, his expression grim and determined. And 2 rows behind them, Marcus noticed, Corinne Holloway had been sitting, watching the entire hearing. She left before he could make eye contact, but not before he caught the expression on her face. It wasn't anger, it was something more measured, more calculated. The underlying property dispute hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. 6 weeks for lawyers to file briefs. 6 weeks for Corinne to think about her strategy. 6 weeks for things to escalate. The second escalation came, unexpectedly, from Jennifer. Jennifer called Marcus on a Thursday evening in late June, her voice smaller than he'd heard it in years. Derek's leaving me, she said without preamble. I don't know if I should feel relieved or devastated, but I'm going with devastated because it's more complicated. Marcus listened. He said nothing. He'd learned over the years that Jennifer rarely needed responses, she needed witnesses. He says it's my fault, Jennifer continued. He says I should have made you take down the pool. He says I should have forced you. And when I didn't, he says it showed that I wasn't committed to supporting him, and a man needs a woman who supports him, and blah, blah, blah. She laughed bitterly. But actually, I think he's leaving because losing the lawsuit made him feel weak, and he can't stand feeling weak. So he's going to find someone else and prove to everyone how strong he is. Jennifer, Marcus tried. Wait, let me finish, Jennifer said. I'm calling because I'm settling with the HOA. I told Derek he needs to pay the settlement, but he won't. He's too busy being angry at you to be productive, so I'm selling the house. I'm selling it to pay the HOA settlement and the legal fees. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. What? The house, Jennifer said. The one we lived in together for 10 years. I'm selling it to pay for this legal mess that Derek started and you made worse. That's not fair, Marcus said. Of course it's not fair, Jennifer replied. None of this is fair, but that's the world now. Derek's gone, I'm homeless. And it's at least partially your fault for being stubborn about the pool instead of just taking it down when I asked you to. She hung up before he could respond. Marcus sat in his living room, holding the phone, and felt the first real weight of consequence settle on his shoulders. Jennifer had done nothing wrong except marry a man with the emotional maturity of a toddler, and ask Marcus to be reasonable. Instead, Marcus had taken an action that was technically within his rights, but practically devastating to someone he'd once loved. He called Patricia. "Jennifer's selling her house to pay the settlement," he said. "That's not your responsibility," Patricia said, but her voice was gentle. "It feels like it is," Marcus said. "Responsibility and legal liability are different things," Patricia said. "You're not liable for Derek's or Jennifer's financial situation. You're not liable for the consequences of their choices." "But I made a choice that cascaded into those consequences," Marcus said. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she finally said, "you did. Welcome to adulthood." The hearing preparation continued. Patricia had Marcus gather documents, take photographs of the property, prepare a timeline of events. She deposed Derek, who, under oath and with his lawyer present, described the pool installation as a gift to the community and claimed that Marcus had been aware of and consenting to the project. Marcus was not aware of this claim until Patricia told him about the deposition. He'd never consented. He'd actively objected. But Derek, under oath, insisted that Marcus had at least been passive about it, which wasn't the same as objecting. "He's lying," Marcus said. "Probably," Patricia agreed. "But proving it is another matter. He's relying on the fact that the installation happened 2 years ago and there's no written documentation of your objection." "But I told Jennifer." "Hearsay," Patricia said. "We'd have to have Jennifer testify that you told her you objected. And given her current financial situation and her relationship to Derek, her testimony would be unreliable." By mid-July, the media had begun to catch wind of the story. A local news station ran a segment on property disputes in residential subdivisions, and the Meadowbrook pool situation was featured prominently. The segment, titled "Who Really Owns Your Property?" interviewed Karen extensively. "The problem is that some people in our community believe they're above the rules," Karen said on camera, and Marcus recognized the cadence of someone who'd practiced this statement. "They believe that because they own property, they can do whatever they want, regardless of the impact on everyone around them. And when the community tries to enforce reasonable standards, they lash out. They destroy things. They hurt people." The segment aired on a Friday night. By Saturday morning, 3 more neighbors had sent letters to Marcus, expressing their concern about his recent actions and their hope that he would take steps toward community reconciliation. One of the letters was from the Chens, people he'd always considered friends. The letter was polite, carefully worded, and devastating in its implications. They suggested that Marcus should consider donating money to a community charity as a way to restore trust and show that you care about the neighborhood. In other words, they were suggesting that Marcus pay for his transgression. He didn't donate any money to any charity. Instead, he did something that Patricia advised against. He wrote a letter to the Meadowbrook Gazette, explaining his side of the story. He described how the pool had been installed without his permission. He explained that he'd asked Derek to remove it. He detailed his attempts to work within the system, including his engagement with the HOA and the legal process. And he concluded with a statement about property rights. "I believe people should have the right to do what they want with their own property. But I also believe that those rights come with responsibilities. The HOA's rules exist for a reason, and when someone ignores those rules while standing on someone else's property, consequences should follow." The letter was published the following Wednesday. By Thursday, there were 5 responses from other neighbors, all of them critical. One letter, written by someone named Stephen Walsh, suggested that Marcus was a blight on our community and should consider whether he even belongs here anymore. Patricia called him. "Why did you do that?" she asked, and she sounded genuinely distressed. "Because the narrative was false," Marcus said. "Of course the narrative was false," Patricia said. "Narratives often are, but you don't fight false narratives by creating true ones. You fight them with discovery documents and depositions and evidence presented to a judge who understands the law. You don't fight them with letters to the local newspaper. So I'm supposed to just let them lie." "You're supposed to let the legal system work," Patricia said. "Which is what we're doing, and we're winning. Judge Mendez already saw through their tactics once. She'll do it again." But Patricia was wrong. The hearing date arrived on August 2nd, 3 weeks before Marcus's birthday. It was a hot day, the kind of Portland summer day that felt like the earth was testing whether air conditioning would hold. Marcus wore a suit that felt too tight. Patricia wore her lawyer armor, sharp blazer, minimal jewelry, the kind of outfit designed to project competence. Judge Mendez was in a different mood. She seemed tired. She seemed like a woman who'd been on the bench too long and had seen too many versions of this exact same dispute played out in different contexts with different characters. This time, the hearing felt less like a serious legal proceeding and more like an obligation, a box to be checked before the judgment, which everyone in the room seemed to already know. Hutchins presented his evidence: the architectural plans for the pool, the HOA documentation, Derek's claims about what constituted the property covenant violations. He argued that even if the pool had technically violated the covenants, Derek's installation of it wasn't criminal, and Marcus's response had been disproportionate. Patricia presented her evidence: the text of the property covenants, the documentation of Marcus's objections, the records showing that Derek had never sought permission from Marcus. She argued that the pool was a clear violation and that Marcus, as the property owner, had the right to remove violations from his own property. The arguments took 4 hours. Judge Mendez asked questions, but they seemed perfunctory, like she was asking them because she was supposed to, not because she actually needed answers. And then Derek took the stand again. This time, Hutchins asked him about the original installation. Derek, comfortable in the role of victim, described how excited he was to improve the property, how he'd done everything in good faith, how he'd believed that Marcus would appreciate the enhancement. "Didn't you discuss the pool with Marcus Webb before installing it?" Hutchins asked. "I discussed it with his ex-wife," Derek said. "She's the one who wanted it." That was the statement that changed things. Patricia stood up immediately. "That's completely false," she said to the judge. "Your Honor, I have testimony from Jennifer Morrison that she asked Marcus to remove the pool multiple times. She never supported its installation." "She may not have explicitly stated it," Derek said, "but she was receptive to the idea, and we proceed with her consent." "You proceed with her consent?" Patricia's voice had taken on an edge of genuine anger. "You installed a $15,000 permanent structure on someone else's property without the owner's explicit approval, and you're characterizing that as reasonable." "Objection," Hutchins said, "argumentative." Judge Mendez held up her hand. "Let me stop you there," she said to the court. "Here's what I'm seeing. The defendant," she gestured to Derek, "installed a pool without the explicit consent of the property owner. The property owner requested its removal. The defendant refused. The property owner, after exhausting what he believed to be his options through the legal system, removed the pool himself." She paused. Whether that removal was perfectly timed with respect to the civil court process is a detail, not a substance. The substance is that the defendant placed something on the plaintiff's property without permission and refused to remove it when asked. In my view, that's trespass. And removing something that's trespassing on your property is self-help, which, while not ideal, is legally defensible. She set down her pen. "I'm ruling in favor of Marcus Webb. The pool installation violated the property covenants. It was installed without the permission of the property owner. The property owner was within his rights to remove it. The defendant is responsible for all legal fees and court costs." She gavelled the hearing closed. It was, objectively, a complete victory for Marcus. Outside the courthouse, Patricia hugged him. Hutchins left quickly, talking on his phone with the kind of urgency that suggested he was going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with Derek. Marcus should have felt elated. Instead, he felt hollow. That feeling intensified 3 days later, when he received an envelope in the mail. It was from the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association, addressed to him personally. Inside was a letter from Corinne Holloway in her official capacity as HOA president. The letter was brief and very formal. "Dear Mr. Webb, after careful review of the recent legal proceedings and consideration of the HOA's bylaws and covenant obligations, we have voted to levy a fine against you for the violation of community standards through your unauthorized demolition activities. The fine is in the amount of $12,500. Additionally, we have voted to require that you restore the landscaping in the area where the pool was located within 90 days, at an estimated cost of $8,000. Failure to comply with either requirement will result in additional fines and potential legal action from the HOA." We believe these measures are necessary to maintain the integrity of our community and to discourage future violations of our established rules. Sincerely, Corinne Halloway, President, Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. Marcus read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing a different kind of nausea. He'd won, he'd been right, he'd been vindicated by a judge. And Corinne had found a way to punish him anyway. Marcus sat across from Patricia in her office, the HOA letter on the desk between them, and felt something inside him shift into a new configuration. "Can they do that?" he asked. "Technically," Patricia said, studying the letter, "the HOA has the authority to levy fines for covenant violations. The question is whether the demolition of the pool constitutes a covenant violation." "But I won," Marcus said. "The judge ruled that I had the right to remove it." "The judge ruled that you had the right to remove it from a property law perspective," Patricia said carefully. "That doesn't necessarily prevent the HOA from arguing that the manner of removal violated community standards." "That's insane," Marcus said. "That's the HOA," Patricia replied. "They have broad powers within the subdivision. The good news is that their fine is probably challengeable. The bad news is that challenging it will cost money." Marcus looked at the letter again. $12,500, $8,000 for landscaping, $2,500 in legal fees so far, $8,500 in demolition costs. His victory was going to cost him nearly $50,000. He thought about Jennifer selling her house. He thought about Derek, probably already pursuing his next scheme. He thought about Corinne, sitting in her pristine colonial, enjoying the knowledge that Marcus had won a battle but lost the war in a way that would have been impossible to predict when he'd called Apex demolition. That night he did something he'd resisted doing since the whole situation began. He called Corinne. She answered on the 3rd ring, as if she'd been waiting. "Marcus," she said, and her voice was pleasant, almost warm. "I was wondering when you'd call." "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "I'm not doing anything," Corinne said. "The HOA board made a decision. I simply carried out their will." "The HOA board is you," Marcus said. "You're the president, you organized this. You set them on me from the beginning." Corinne was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to know why?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that suggested she'd been waiting for this conversation for weeks. "Yes," Marcus said. "Because I watched you have an opportunity to do the right thing, and instead you did the thing that was right for you," Corinne said. "Jennifer asked you to remove the pool. She was devastated by it. But you decided that it was more important to be right about property rights than to be kind to someone you'd loved. You decided that principle was more important than community." "That's not fair," Marcus said. "It's not about fair," Corinne said. "It's about integrity. It's about understanding that we live in communities and communities require compromise. But you decided that your rights as a property owner superseded the needs of the people around you. So I decided to remind you that rights exist within a context. By destroying me financially, by making the consequences of your choices clear," Corinne said. "You wanted to exercise your property rights. Fine, you have them, but those rights have costs, they have consequences, and now you know what those consequences look like." Marcus hung up. He called Patricia the next morning. "I want to fight the fine," he said. "It will cost more money than the fine," Patricia warned him. "I don't care," Marcus said. "I won the underlying case. That should mean something." Patricia sighed. "Okay," she said. "But you should understand what we're doing here. We're escalating. Corinne will escalate back. We'll go to court. They'll appeal. This could drag on for years." "I'm aware," Marcus said. The legal battle that followed was exactly as protracted and painful as Patricia had warned. The HOA appealed the landscaping requirement. Marcus appealed the fine. Motions were filed. Briefs were written. Depositions were taken. And through it all, Corinne maintained a posture of reasonable concern. In her depositions, she never said anything overtly hostile. She explained that she was just trying to maintain community standards. She described the pool as an ongoing source of tension in the neighborhood. She detailed the numerous complaints she'd received from neighbors about Marcus's behavior. "What behavior?" Patricia asked during one deposition. "What specifically did Mr. Webb do beyond demolishing a pool on his own property?" "He violated community standards," Corinne said smoothly. He showed a disregard for the HOA's authority. He set a precedent that property owners could take unilateral action without community input. Patricia pressed, did he violate any specific covenant? Karen hesitated. Not specifically, but the spirit of the covenants is about community harmony. The spirit of the covenants, Patricia repeated, is that anyone can be fined for something that violates the abstract concept of community harmony. If the board determines it, Karen said, that's what we're voted in to do. The first ruling came 9 months after the landscaping fine was imposed. Judge Mendez, with visible irritation, ruled that the HOA had overstepped its authority. The fine was excessive and punitive rather than remedial, she wrote. It violated the basic principle that fines should be commensurate with the violation. She vacated the HOA fine entirely. Marcus should have been satisfied with this outcome. He had, after all, won again. Instead, he felt something darker, the realization that Karen had already achieved her goal. Whether the fine stood or not was irrelevant. The fact of the fine's existence, the protracted legal battle, the financial toll, all of that had already changed things. The neighborhood had changed. The Chens no longer greeted him at the mailbox. Stephen Walsh, the man who'd called him a blight on our community, had started a community safety patrol, which apparently involved watching Marcus's yard more carefully than previous neighborhood watches had done. Jennifer had moved to Seattle with a new boyfriend. Derek had moved to Bend, where, according to Facebook, he was apparently starting a new cryptocurrency venture. They'd both left the area, both transformed by the consequences of the pool dispute. But Marcus remained, and the neighborhood had closed ranks against him in a way that was entirely legal and entirely devastating. He couldn't sell the house. Who would want to buy property owned by the guy at the center of the neighborhood's most infamous legal dispute? He couldn't improve it. Any improvement would likely trigger another HOA challenge. He could only live there, in a house he owned but no longer felt welcome in, surrounded by people who decided he was the villain of the story. 3 months after Judge Mendez's ruling vacating the fine, Marcus received a call from a woman named Eleanor Price. "I'm sorry to bother you," Eleanor said on the phone, "but I'm a journalist. I'm writing a piece about HOA power and abuse, and I was wondering if you'd like to talk to me about your experience." Marcus almost said no. Then he thought about Karen, about the narrative she'd built, about the way the truth had been shaped into something that served her purposes. "Yes," he said, "let's talk." The article ran in the Portland Mercury 8 weeks later, a long-form piece titled "The Unaccountable Neighborhood Watch: How HOAs Abuse Power and Silence Their Critics." It featured Marcus's story prominently, with photographs of his property and detailed accounts of the legal proceedings. It also, inevitably, featured Karen's response. Karen gave a statement to Eleanor Price denying that she'd ever intended to punish Marcus and claiming that she'd simply been trying to maintain community standards. She mentioned that Marcus's actions had violated community trust, and that sometimes maintaining that trust required difficult conversations. Eleanor Price, a skilled journalist, had also interviewed other HOA presidents in the Portland area. Several of them acknowledged that HOAs often operated in legal gray areas and that there was a tendency for HOA boards to exceed their authority when conflicts arose. The article was fair, balanced, and devastating to Karen's version of events. The day after the article was published, the neighborhood held an emergency HOA meeting. Marcus, as a property owner in good standing, had the right to attend. He went. The meeting was held in the community center, a small white building that served as the neighborhood's central gathering place. Perhaps 40 people showed up, a fraction of the neighborhood, but enough to represent a kind of critical mass of opinion. Karen opened by acknowledging the article. "I was disappointed by the representation," she said to the crowd. "But I think it's important that we not let external criticism distract from our core mission, which is maintaining our community values." A man Marcus didn't recognize raised his hand. "I read the article," he said, "and I think Karen was right to try to maintain standards, but I also think maybe we got a little carried away with the whole thing." Another hand shot up, a woman this time. "I think the article was unfair," the woman said. "Marcus destroyed property. Karen was just doing her job. The fact that the judge sided with him doesn't mean he was right." But he was right, another neighbor said. According to the judge, which is how the law works. The law isn't about right and wrong, Karen interjected. It's about jurisdiction. The judge had jurisdiction over property rights, but she didn't have jurisdiction over community standards. That's not true, Marcus found himself saying, and every head in the room turned toward him. He stood up. The judge absolutely had jurisdiction over community standards, he said. That's what the covenants are. That's what the HOA enforces. And the judge determined that the HOA's fine violated that authority. That's not an opinion. That's a legal determination. You destroyed a pool, Karen said, and her voice had taken on that particular undertone of reasonable concern that Marcus had come to hate. On my property, Marcus said, that I owned and that you put there without permission. I didn't put it there, Karen said. Derek did. But you've spent 2 years trying to protect it, Marcus said. And then when I removed it, you tried to punish me for removing something from my own land. You called the police. You had me arrested. You weren't arrested, Karen said calmly. You filed legal motions against me. You went to the media. You organized the neighborhood against me. And when the judge ruled in my favor, you found another way to punish me. That's not community standards. That's vendetta. The room was silent. Marcus could feel the division in the room crystallizing. People who thought Marcus had a point, and people who believed Karen's narrative was fundamentally correct. Karen smiled, and it was perhaps the most calculated expression Marcus had ever seen on another human's face. I'm sorry you see it that way, she said to Marcus. Truly, I was never trying to punish you. I was trying to create a community where people could coexist peacefully. But you've made it clear that's not what you want, so I think we're done here. She turned to the rest of the room. I move to close this meeting, she said. No one seconded the motion. The meeting, technically, continued. But Karen had accomplished what she wanted. She'd made it clear that Marcus was not welcome. She'd painted him as unreasonable, vindictive, unable to participate in community dialogue. And she'd done all of it while positioning herself as the rational actor, the person trying to maintain civility in the face of someone's inability to compromise. It was a masterclass in narrative control, and it worked. After the meeting, 3 neighbors approached Marcus to express support. The rest avoided eye contact or left quickly. Marcus drove home in the dark, his hands tight on the steering wheel, and realized something that had been slowly crystallizing over the past 18 months. He'd already lost, no matter what any judge said. He'd made a decision that was legal, defensible, and completely right, and that decision had made him a pariah in the place he lived. That night he called a real estate agent. The house sold in 40 days, at $120,000 below asking price. The realtor explained that the media attention and some neighborhood history made it a challenging sell, so Marcus would need to price aggressively. Marcus, tired of fighting, agreed. The closing took place in a lawyer's office on a cold morning in December. Marcus signed papers transferring ownership to a family named Rutherford. He pocketed the check, about $340,000 after the realtor fees and the price reduction and his own legal costs. It wasn't enough to make him whole, but it was enough to start over somewhere else. He'd already put a deposit on a condo in the Pearl District, a part of Portland where neighbors didn't know each other and nobody cared what you did with your property. He'd already quit his job. The pandemic had made remote work possible, and he'd found a freelance contract that would pay the bills. On his last day in Meadowbrook, he drove through the neighborhood slowly. The cul-de-sac where Derek's pool had been was now a well-landscaped yard with a native plant garden and a small stone patio. The Rutherfords, apparently, had decided to make something beautiful out of the absence. Karen's house looked the same as always, pristine, controlled, perfect. Marcus didn't stop there. He drove to the community center, parked, and walked to the small library inside. He found the back issues of the Meadowbrook Gazette on a shelf and pulled out the edition with the headline about Karen's fight for community values. He read it one more time, seeing now with clear eyes exactly how the narrative had been constructed. Every quote carefully chosen, every perspective selectively presented, every truth bent just slightly to serve a particular story. He put the newspaper back. On his way out, he ran into Alina Price, the journalist who'd written the Mercury article. She was apparently doing a follow-up piece and had come to interview people at the neighborhood center. "Marcus," she said, seeming genuinely happy to see him, "are you still living here?" "Not for much longer," he said. "I'm moving in a few weeks." Alina's expression shifted to sympathy. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know the article didn't make things easier." "The article didn't make things harder," Marcus said. "Things were already hard. The article just documented how hard they were." "Corinne's actually running for city council," Alina said. "Did you know that?" Marcus looked at her. Apparently there was some quote from one of the city council members saying that HOA reforms were needed, Alina explained. Corinne's campaign is running with the narrative that she's trying to prevent the kind of HOA abuses that the Mercury documented. She's positioning herself as the moderate voice that prevents the system from becoming too extreme. "Of course she is," Marcus said. "Isn't that ironic?" Alina asked. "It's not ironic," Marcus said. "It's consistent. Corinne's entire approach has been to reframe her own behavior as the rational, necessary response to someone else's unreasonableness. Running for city council to prevent HOA abuses is just the logical extension of that narrative." Marcus left Meadowbrook on a Friday morning in early January. The weather was typical Portland winter, gray, drizzling, the kind of day where the sky and the earth seemed to be blending into each other. He loaded the last boxes into a U-Haul, did a final walkthrough of the empty house, and left the keys on the kitchen counter for the realtor to collect. On the drive to his new place in the Pearl District, Marcus thought about what he'd learned. He'd learned that being right wasn't the same as winning. He'd learned that legal systems, while theoretically designed to dispense justice, were more often designed to provide a framework within which people could fight, indefinitely, until resources ran out. He'd learned that communities were more fragile than they seemed, and that a single conflict could fracture the social bonds that held them together. But most importantly, he'd learned about narrative. He'd learned that the truth mattered far less than what people believed to be true. He'd learned that a skilled operator could take facts, all of them accurate, and arrange them in a way that served a particular conclusion. He'd learned that once a narrative was established, it was nearly impossible to dislodge it, no matter what evidence you presented. Corinne had learned this too, and she was now going to leverage that knowledge to run for city council on a platform of HOA reform. It would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. 3 months later, Marcus read that Corinne had won her city council election with 58% of the vote. The local news ran a profile of her describing her as a community advocate dedicated to protecting neighborhood integrity while preventing government overreach. Marcus didn't contact her. He didn't write a letter to the editor. He didn't do anything. Instead, he spent his time settling into his new apartment, establishing a new routine, and slowly building a life that didn't include his former neighborhood or the people who'd inhabited it. Jennifer, he learned through Facebook, had moved back to Portland and was working as a project manager for a tech company. She seemed happy, or at least as happy as people could appear in carefully selected social media photos. Derek, the last time Marcus checked, had moved to California and was apparently involved in yet another startup venture. The Rutherford family, the couple who'd bought Marcus's house, seemed to be enjoying it. They posted pictures of a garden they were planting, a patio they were building, a life they were constructing in the space that Marcus had abandoned. That was probably how it should be. The house wasn't his anymore. The neighborhood wasn't his anymore. The story, once it left his hands, would be reinterpreted and refigured by whoever came next. Marcus thought sometimes about what he might have done differently. He could have left the pool alone. He could have accepted the fine. He could have moved away earlier before the neighborhood had fully mobilized against him. But he knew in the deepest part of himself that the problem wasn't anything Marcus had done wrong. The problem was that he'd been encountered by someone, Corinne, who had decided that his existence, his choices, his way of being in the world represented a threat to the narrative she'd constructed about herself and her community. And once that had happened, the outcome was almost inevitable. You couldn't compromise with someone who decided that compromise itself was a form of weakness. You couldn't reason with someone who'd already reframed your reasonable arguments as unreasonable selfishness. You couldn't win against someone who'd learned that the game itself, the maintenance of the narrative, the accumulation of allies, the strategic use of community authority, was more important than the actual facts. Corinne had understood this intuitively. Marcus had been forced to learn it through bitter experience. On the evening of his first month in the new apartment, Marcus stood at his window and looked out at the Portland skyline. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement below. It was beautiful in the way cities were beautiful, complex, contradictory, full of people pursuing their own narratives. He thought about the pool, now gone from his life but still existing in the landscape of his former neighborhood, still shaping how people thought about him and about community and about property rights, and about the kinds of people who would demolish things on principle. The pool would outlive him in people's memories. The story would be told and retold, each version slightly different from the last, until eventually the truth would be so distant from the narrative that they wouldn't look like the same event at all. That was how it worked, that was what he'd learned. And knowing it, Marcus found, was both the saddest and most liberating thing of all.